I would see him as, in this way, very much a man of his time, a time when what is so valued, maybe valued most, is political power secured by military force.
Welcome to Lesche, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning. I'm a classicist at Brown University, and I'm getting over a cold, which is why I sound like this today. Alexander III of Macedon, better known as Alexander the Great, is a historical figure that few classicists can escape. For those who work on classical Greece, his rise tends to mark a kind of cutoff point. And for those who work on anything after, it was his campaigns outside of Greece that had completely altered and redefined the Greek world. Yet his legacy is a difficult one to wrestle with, especially today. Plutarch, in his parallel lives, paired Alexander with Julius Caesar, who has seen his fair share of activity in the way of new translations over the last decade or so. And here's where I think of Michael Kulikowski's magisterial review in the London Review of Books of one of those translations. That review is a lengthy essay titled A Very Bad Man, and Kulikowski begins with this observation. Even today, Caesar's legionaries and their colorful Gallic foes are bread and butter for companies that sell expensive toy soldiers to middle-aged schoolboys. One recent series of figurines featured the scourging of a Gallic prisoner, the crucifixion of a tribal chieftain, and a grim-faced centurion overseeing the punishment detail. If we leave aside the question of who precisely covets these sadistic tableaux, they get one thing right. Julius Caesar was the first genocidaire in European history. Okay, so Caesar as first genocidaire of European history. Well, there is, however, of course, a line that's a title that actually belongs to Alexander the Great. And this is where it's no coincidence that Plutarch pairs Caesar with Alexander. The conquests for which these two men were so celebrated in antiquity and very much beyond it have come to look very different in the light of today. And yet, both of these figures must be reckoned with as individuals who shaped, including in literal cartographic terms, the classical world, and as men whose legacies have likewise shaped the modern discipline of classics. With her new book, Alexander at the End of the World, Rachel Kousser zooms in on what is arguably the most complex, enigmatic, and also consequential period of Alexander's career, namely the 7 years that he spent in Asia after his destruction of the Persian royal headquarters at Persepolis. Alexander had stylized his campaign into Persia as a mission to seek revenge for Persia's invasions of Greece in the early 5th century. And yet, even when the smoldering ruins of Persepolis bore witness to his success in that mission to avenge, Alexander chose not to return home to Macedon, but instead to press further eastward on bloody campaigns of subjugation and conquest. The story, then, of what happened next is the story that Rachel Kousser sets out to tell in Alexander at the End of the World. Rachel Kousser writes and teaches about Alexander the Great, the destruction of monuments in ancient Greece, and the representation of gender and power in the Mediterranean world. For her work, she has received fellowships from the National Endowment of the Humanities, the Getty Research Institute, and the Center for Advanced Study of the Visual Arts. She's published articles in Art Bulletin, the American Journal of Archaeology, and Res, Archaeology and Aesthetics, as well as 2 books with Cambridge University Press. Rachel is currently the chair of the Classics program at the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and a professor of ancient art and archaeology at Brooklyn College. She has a BA in Classics and Art History from Yale University and a Ph.D. in Classical Art and Archaeology from New York University's Institute of Fine Arts. Just a quick note that, as ever, I put a few references in the show notes for this episode. So now, I'd like to welcome into the Lesche Rachel Kousser, author of Alexander at the End of the World. The next voice you'll be hearing is hers.
So the reason I think Alexander is right for now is because, first of all, I feel that the later part of his career, these last years, are really often left out in modern retellings, or they're just presented as this kind of degenerate aftermath of a once promising career. So, like, the big emphasis is on the big battles, and then, there's this narrative that everything goes haywire. But to me, those are the years that are interesting because this is when Alexander is transformed from this kind of implausibly successful young king to this mature, experienced, often unheroic leader. So I was interested in that as a sort of image of Alexander as a more complicated hero. I was also interested in this as a question of leadership, and we're thinking right now a lot about political leadership. What makes a good leader? What is it to inspire a nation, but also what is it to be responsible for the nation, and how to integrate into and forge a multicultural empire and forge a multicultural state out of people of very disparate languages, religions, cultures. And I felt that that was something that Alexander struggles with throughout his career, and we see him trying, failing, and trying again. And it's a question that is very, very much of the present.
Well, one of the principal arguments of the book is that Alexander's conquests, well, of course, they changed the worlds, the lands, the peoples that he was conquering, but they also changed him. In what way do you see Alexander as a person evolving over these last years in particular?
I think that the early years of his conquest are fairly straightforward. He fights a lot of big battles. He's good at fighting big battles. And he doesn't have, it's almost like a frictionless glide. And then when he gets to, say, Eastern Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia, he faces a lot more resistance, particularly guerrilla warfare. And I think he has to change the kind of battles he's good at fighting and figure out how to negotiate with people who are very different and have very different sets of priorities. And that, to me, is really interesting. It's sort of like seeing him figure out how to change his worldview or question his own worldview and work with these different people in Central Asia, South Asia, etc. So I think he becomes slowly over time better at learning how to negotiate, cut deals rather than just sort of overwhelm people with military force. And that is what makes this part interesting.
Well, maybe we could talk a little bit about this moment that you start with in the chapter City on Fire, which is with the burning of the palace infrastructure at Persepolis, because I think that if you work on this period, actually as I happen to do from the Greek end of things, in some ways that's where from the Greek mainland, people kind of lose interest, right? Is that, okay, this, the stated aim of Alexander's expedition, his what he was up to as he went east has now been accomplished in a way, right? Which is, the narrative about this revenge for the Persian Wars, which maybe we can talk about because that's obviously very deep rooted and very complicated.
Yeah.
But that's where you begin. So I was hoping that, I was also very taken by your description of what he did there. So I'll just read a brief paragraph if that's okay. And then maybe we could talk a little bit about this question of why he did this.
Yeah.
So you write in this first chapter that when Alexander unleashed his men on the lower city of Persepolis, the thin, chill air was filled with the sounds of the sack. Men shouting, heavy running footsteps, women screaming in terror, the dull, sickening thud of swords meeting flesh. Soldiers fought each other for precious objects and killed captives whose ransom paled in comparison with the wealth that surrounded them. Some Persians committed suicide, dressing in their most expensive clothes before throwing themselves off the city's high walls with their wives and children. Others set fire to their houses and burned themselves to death. It was a terrible fate for the symbolic heart of the Persian Empire. So when I was in graduate school, first learning about Alexander the Great, the first question that we began with in the seminar was this classic, why did Alexander burn the palace at Persepolis? So could you just speak to that a little bit and what your take on that old chestnut is?
Yeah, well, it's a real challenge to answer for a number of reasons. The first one is that our literary sources are in conflict. We have both Arrian, who says, this was totally intentional, and then the kind of dinner party that really got out of hand theory pushed by Theodorus Siculus.
So that he was just drunk and a courtesan was like, hey, try, maybe you could do this.
Yeah, and there's this courtesan, Thais, and, and it's just really, it's a moment of passion, and he later regrets it.
Yeah, party that got out of hand, right?
Yeah. So I think the thing is, these literary sources are in conflict, and there's only so much you can do about mining the text, and that's how most classicists deal with this subject, right? But as somebody whose primary focus is archaeology, I felt like it was really important to go back because, after all, we have the city of Persepolis. Ironically, it's relatively well preserved because Alexander burned it down. It was never substantially re-inhabited. It's, in fact, a UNESCO World Heritage Site now. And it was excavated by the University of Chicago in the 30s, in the Oriental Institute, or what was then the Oriental Institute. So we have quite good records. And they're well published in these big, huge volumes that I sat in the Columbia, 3 big, huge volumes I sat in the Columbia Library for a while reading and thought, this is stuff people have not been coming at with the eye of an archaeologist. So as somebody who is trained in archaeology, I looked at this and was like, it is so clear that this must have been intentional because this place is completely cleaned out of anything that was, covered in 3 feet of ash. So it was not for the most part disturbed, and it's so cleaned out of every possible metal, say, anything portable and valuable. The archaeologists were even able to see sort of where there are heaped up piles of things like cloth of gold. They've got those little bits of the cloth of gold that remains, so they can see places where things are heaped up that will burn intentionally for setting fire. So it's not just him sort of running around with a torch. So it seems quite intentional, and we do have to all have in Plutarch this discussion of Alexander bringing camels and donkeys to Persepolis and then moving the treasure out already. So I think we have a good sense that this, he had plans from Persepolis and he was thinking about them well in advance. Other question, of course, is, who's he doing it for? I see Alexander as somebody who's really good at using violence strategically, and particularly using the destruction of monuments strategically, which is something that I see him doing from very early on, for instance, in the sack of Thebes, where he intentionally leaves the temples in the House of Tinder, and I see it again here. So he's using it strategically, and I think from a Greek's perspective, of course, it was desirable because he is sort of vengeance for Xerxes' burning down of Athens, etc., 150 years earlier. But if you look at the sort of broader political landscape, the people that Alexander is, by this point, worried about and most in need of sending messages to are not the Greeks, who are, who have soldiers with him, who have been fairly quiescent for a number of years. Even the rebellion of the Spartans, his Antipater puts out without too much trouble. It's really the Persians. And what Alexander, I think, is doing here is using a very Persian kind of strategy. The Persians, after all, had been destroying monuments as a form of symbolic violence for 150 years plus. That's what they did in Athens. And it seems to be part of their strategy of making a war. So when Alexander adopts it, he's destroying this important political and ritual center, and that shows the Persians that, their capital is not only is their capital close, but their king can't protect it. One should remember that Darius III is still alive and very much heading toward Afghanistan to try and raise another army. So the fact that he shows this sort of way, shows to the Persians the ways in which their king is failing them, I think is very intentional.
So what if we sort of flip then that standard question on its head and asked if from archaeological sources there's a suggestion that, probably even in antiquity, it could have been clear that this was an intentional action on Alexander's part. Why would there be, do you think, the tradition that this was just an act of drunken partying gone wrong, waking up thinking, oh God, what did I do? Why would that be a line in the sources?
For this, you really have to go back to my earlier book on the destruction of monuments. because I think that in that book I argue very strongly that from the Persian Wars onward, there is this strong Greek discourse that says we are civilized and one of the things we do not do is destroy temples, statues, other monuments. This is something barbarians do, and it is a barbaric and impious act. And so I think there is a discomfort with the idea that Alexander is engaging in something that's barbaric. And Polybius, in fact, who is generally speaking a good historian, says, well, even Alexander, who's complaining about Philip V at the time, he's like, even Alexander, when he went to Persia, didn't destroy the temple. He was good, he was respectful of monuments. And you're like, did he not read about this Persepolis thing? But I think there is this discomfort. And so it's somehow, if he was just doing it in a moment of passion, that made it more, in a weird way, acceptable.
One of the lines on Alexander is that he remains an object of just perennial fascination, largely because people cannot decide or agree upon whether he was good or bad.
Yeah.
What would your response to that be? I think, not so much asking whether Alexander was good or bad, but to what extent, even maybe in the ancient sources, this is a question that is itself, the subject in a way that is drawing people to keep revisiting this biography and this constellation of issues over and over.
I think it's important to try and present him in the fullness of his humanity. I think people like Tarn wanted to see him as this kind of forerunner of Christ and this very unifying, heroic figure. And then with Badian and Bosworth, you get, on the other hand, this kind of autocratic megalomaniac, etc. And I was really, my sense is that neither of those does full justice to Alexander in his own context, where he's not simply acting, but he's acted upon. And I think that we have to remember he's not working in a vacuum, and there are lots of other people around him, and they shape and change him. It's really, to me, like Alexander becomes Alexander sort of when his empire strikes back. So, I think that he has this almost untrammeled political power, and I don't want to whitewash him or deny the extraordinary power he exercises. And that gives him the opportunity both to do things that are terrible, like the destruction of Persepolis, but also to act in a more unconstrained way. That isn't always, and I would say, for instance, to make decisions that are unpopular but probably wise decisions, strategic decisions. So I tried in my book very much to see him as a complex, struggling, failing human being rather than as a kind of cardboard cutout, either good or bad.
Yeah, you make the argument I found very interesting that these last years in particular are more defined by the failure, and he's more defined by his failures than in the earlier chapters. And I was wondering also, as I was reading your book, it struck me trying to think about earlier historical figures from the Greek historiographical tradition that were portrayed as psychologically really complicated. And I was having a hard time thinking of many before Alexander. I mean, the best one I could come up with was maybe Alcibiades.
Yeah.
It strikes me that this could be part of, this magnet that keeps attracting people to Alexander is that, we have this handful of sources and they're in a way each giving us a different Alexander, which seems to be suggesting that this is a person who is, chameleonic in some ways, but who also maybe even just had the sort of psychological, who certainly had the psychological depth that anybody does. And I was wondering to what extent, you were reflecting on that question of his psychology.
His psychology is very hard to get at. And I really tried to, in my book, sort of make this hard line where I talked about what we know he knew at a given moment and to try and stay away from what he thought. Plutarch and Curtius and so on are very free with what he thought at various moments. And I thought, well, I just don't feel that, that's not where I want to go. I want to be able to say, here's what he knew, here's what he may have thought, aimed to do, but I didn't want to say that this is how he feels. Because I think that is really difficult. I would also say that one of the fun facts I picked up about Alexander recently is that there's this website called character.ai where you can talk to a historical figure courtesy of ChatGPT or something. And 1.4 million people have interviewed Alexander the Great this way. 1.7 have interviewed Julius Caesar, so he's slightly under. But, I think here there is this continued fascination because we don't quite know what to make of him. And of course, that's partly because we didn't leave anything, we don't have journals, we don't have letters that I would believe in anyway. But also, I think because he died so young. And so it's much harder to, it's like JFK. There's a lot of fascination because we don't really know how he might have grown and changed later on.
What also makes me think in a way of that sort of anecdote in Lucian on the writing of history, where Alexander says to one of his court historians, I'd be curious to kind of come back and hear what people make of what you're writing later on, because everybody just tells me it's great right now, but I'm sort of in the fullness of time, I'm curious to hear what people will make of what I've done here. And, in the sources, that idea of pathos, right? And even in the portraiture, this sort of Alexander, the way I was taught it was that, he's always looking out at the distant horizon. There is this kind of psychologizing, that is invited, even if it's created by the tradition. But I was wondering to come back to Persepolis in a way. And I think that this is one of the questions that really lies at the heart of your book is why did he keep going after Persepolis?
The first thing I would say is that, I would see him as, in this way, very much a man of his time, a time when what is so valued, maybe valued most, is political power secured by military force. I would say that's something that you can look at the Melian dialogues, you can look at Thebes. Alexander is not alone in this. He just did it better. And so he kept winning. So I would see his aspirations in that way as very much congruent with the aspirations of others, but with greater, he was tremendous at all kinds of different aspects of military leadership.
Well, as he continues, and again, when, the arguments about, and this is in the sources, the way that he's becoming, he's adopting the trappings of, these other cultures. He's becoming, there's more syncretism. We get famous moments like the Proskinesis episode and all of that.
Yeah.
How would you account for then that even as he's showing more and more interest in assimilating himself or absorbing these other models of kingship and rulership into his person and into the way that he projects power, that at the same time he seems to also be becoming more and more violent? That these, the massacres kind of just keep piling up. I, read this in, I don't know how one could know this, but, just for orders of magnitude, that it's been conjectured that by the time that Alexander leaves for India, 100,000 Bactrians and Sogdians are dead because of him. And that this just keeps, it just gets even nastier in India, where you get the kind of intertwining of what he's doing with what's happening to him, which, is, I guess, one of the things that you're really interested in, this sort of savageness of the siege of Mali. That's then, there's the furiousness that the Macedonians have because Alexander's injured. And then this leads to this incredible retaliation. So you have both what happens to Alexander and how that then has these incredible consequences for the path and the process of conquest. So, yeah, I guess, what would you make of that seeming dissonance between him becoming more and more interested in the conquered peoples, but more and more violent toward them?
I would say he's becoming more interested in them and he's experimenting and trying things out. They don't always work, as with the Proskinesis episode. I would be a bit more hesitant to endorse the idea that he is, in fact, becoming uniformly more violent. I think that has a lot to do with our literary sources, which saw the killing of so-called barbarians as generally a good thing. And there are a number of episodes, including those of the Mali, where they suggest, massacres on this unprecedented scale and, this entire people is wiped out. Well, no, because the ambassadors come from the Malian Sadraki a couple weeks later when Alexander is recovering, and they clearly do this careful negotiation, which suggests that there are a lot of them left. So I think that there is, the further you get from places the Greeks were familiar with, the more the sort of, hand-waving about, and then you killed millions of people. That, I think, one should view them with more skepticism. What I do think changes is that these places are sort of more loosely held, or in the case of South Asia, once you get past the Indus, not really part of the Persian Empire at all. So he has sort of more instead of being able to come into a province and do a deal with the general, the governor in charge, and then move on, which is what happens in much of the Western Empire. He's got sort of more low-level conflict, and he's got to kind of make individual arrangements with different people. It takes him a while to figure that out. But I would say that I think that both the Greek sources and sort of the modern ones are probably, but I would view their casualty figures with more skepticism.
One of the ways I think that you can also trace in your narrative Alexander's own evolution is through who he's marrying or who he's associating with. He's not married to Barsine, but they have this relationship, the questions of consent always being there. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about these women and to what extent the narrative progression around Alexander's life can be pegged to what he's doing with his personal life, which of course is the distinction between the personal, the private and the public for Alexander is blurry at best. But yeah, could you just speak a little bit about these women in his life?
Yeah, they were one of the things that was most fascinating to me, because I feel as though it's one of the few places in ancient history where, because the spotlight is on Alexander is so intense, you sort of see these people in his penumbra that otherwise would be totally or largely invisible to us. So Barsine is one for sure, and she's one of the people I found most fascinating.
Do you mind just saying a bit about her, actually? Because I hadn't, there's always Roxana, and then, the wedding at Susa, the mass wedding at Susa. That I think that kind of comes more into the historical narrative when you learn about these things as important political moments. But I was also really gripped by this story of Barsine, that's someone that Alexander had known in childhood and then re-encounters in these extraordinary conditions. Do you mind just saying a bit about who she was and how they met back up?
Yeah, if I could go back and interview one person, that was who I really want to interview, because her father is a Persian governor and descendant of great kings. Her mother is a Rhodian, and the mother's brothers, Memnon and Mentor, are condottieri in the service of the Persian king. So how those two got together, I have no idea. But in any case, her parents her father runs afoul of the Persian king and flees to Philip II, Philip's court, when Alexander must have been about in kindergarten. And they stay for somewhere between 7 to 10 years. So you can imagine, if you're Alexander, you're growing up, and there's at court this fascinating family that is intercultural, includes, people who are experienced as military leaders of the Persians, but then he's seeing these people who, must have spoken both languages and sort of did these things. And Barsine must have been around Alexander's age, maybe a little older. So, one can imagine them even interacting as children. Then times change. Barsine's father is forgiven. They go back to Persia, and a few years later find themselves fighting Alexander. And Barsine gets married first to one of her uncles and then to the other, these Greek uncles that are condottieri. So, and both of them die very early on. conquest. So she is with other high-ranking Persian elite women who was captured after the Battle of Issus, and in 333. And Alexander very conspicuously, at least in the literary sources, doesn't have anything to do with the Persian queen and the Persian princesses, but he does choose Brycenia. By this point, she's widowed twice. She has children of her own. She's supposed to be very beautiful and also very well educated, which must have been quite unusual at the time. And she seems, while the Persian royal family stays at Susa, she seems to travel with Alexander throughout and bears him a son either in 327 or in 324. So it seems as though she comes along all the way to Afghanistan. At some point, her father and brothers make peace, and her father, in fact, then becomes a governor in northern Afghanistan for Alexander, and her brothers become high-ranking members of his army. And one of her sisters and one of her daughters are married off at the great wedding in Susa in 324. So I think she must have been someone who both he was in some ways fond of and interested in, and he often, he seems to have trusted the people he was with in childhood the most in a lot of ways. And so the fact that she was somebody he had known from childhood, it doesn't surprise me that she's the one he would choose. But also she modeled for him someone who was able to navigate between Greece and Persia because she had done both of those things. And I think he was likely helpful to him in doing that, both sort of on a personal level, but also politically.
Well, one of the things that also emerged for me from your narrative is that the standard line on Alexander is that he was in many ways sort of forging these models of multiculturalism within these lands, but just how it was really already there.
Yeah.
He brings a different politics and a different method to it. But, in many ways, thinking back even to 75 years earlier in Xenophon's Anabasis, the account of running into Greek cities in Asia Minor and people who are multilingual, and really just kind of jumped out from the book at how much of this landscape is actually already there.
Yeah, and we aren't seeing it necessarily because, although Xenophon is a good example, and to the contrary, often from a Greek perspective, that's not the narrative they're presenting. But I think it was there. I think, if you look at the tombs along the coast of what is now Turkey, they have this fascinating melding in the generations before Alexander, kind of thing, of Greek and Persian. And I think we're kind of seeing it a little bit through Greek blinders, and from a Persian perspective, or from the perspective of, say, Greeks living in Persia, there was probably already a lot of interconnection between those two cultures well before Alexander, and he's just sort of taking it to another level.
You mentioned earlier the insight that can be brought from the archaeological record that hasn't been tapped maybe in the way that it should have, and also just because there have been finds or relatively recent finds. Could you just speak a little bit more to what the archaeological record what light that can shed on things that maybe the literary sources who are in so much disagreement and conflict anyway amongst themselves, what can the archaeology tell us that they can't?
So there are two things that I think are make using the literary sources as your exclusive record challenging. One is that the earliest preserved sources are 300 years after Alexander's death. So it's like writing a biography of George Washington when your earliest sources are now. And the second is that they are all these kind of powerful Greek and Roman men speaking to other powerful men about a famous ruler. And they're always presenting him from this Greco-Roman perspective and not a Persian one. And it's not like they're maybe trying to suppress the Persian perspective, but it's just not their perspective. And so one of the things that I feel my book really benefited from was the Renaissance in Achaemenid studies over the past, say, 25, 30 years, which has given us, there's been tremendously good work done kind of mining the say, Persian administrative records, particularly Persian Persepolis fortification tablets and things like that, to give us a sense of the vitality of the Persian Empire in the age of Alexander. And there's, I think, the people who are studying from the Persian perspective also are much more comfortable drawing on archaeological evidence. So not just tablets or the leather records from Afghanistan, but there are, for instance, finds of granaries that are sort of like, almost like, replicated in groups. Fascinating site in what is now Israel of these granaries that seem to be a whole bunch of them, all the same size, all used as a depot for when the Persian army is moving through. So it just gives you a sense of how well the Persians were able to kind of plan in advance and the resources that they had. And I think that's really changing understanding of how Alexander was able to invade this place and changing particularly our narrative, which is often, Alexander won because the Persian Empire was weak. And I think the more we learn about the Persian Empire and how well it was functioning at the time of Alexander, that what he's doing instead is this kind of jiu-jitsu ability to use the resources of the Persian Empire against itself by co-opting its most capable governors, by capturing the treasuries, by living off the material from these depots that was very conveniently assembled for him by the Persian kings, as it were, and incorporating Persians into his army. He's able to use all of that against Darius, and that's a lot of what was successful. So instead, he's not winning because the Persian Empire is weak. He's winning because the Persian Empire is strong.
No, I was just going to ask then, how, with such a big story, how did you even approach the process of researching and writing this book? This kind of granular information about the places in particular, for me, it was a very sensory book in the way that you seem to be trying to evoke these places and these landscapes. It took a lot of research that was, let's say, Alexander adjacent, not necessarily in Curtius or whatever, to figure out, what you could see from what vantage point or which flowers bloom in what season, in Sogdia. Mm-hmm. Could you say a little bit about just how you tackled this?
It was a real challenge. I started out doing what almost everyone does. I went to the area in modern Greece, which is once Macedonia, and saw, the tombs and so on. I've been to Turkey. I went to a number of sort of major European collections of archaeological material, the most useful of which was Paris, because they had not only the wonderful Musée Guimet, but a number of the archaeologists who had worked in Afghanistan before the Soviet invasion, and they were super helpful in helping me understand what it was like before that happened and giving me a sense of it. And I was hoping to go and visit them the next year in Uzbekistan, where many of them are now excavated. Unfortunately, when I was going to go visit them, that was 2020. So I spent the next few years writing about a guy trying to reach the end of the world from a small corner of northern Manhattan. And I didn't get to go to any of those places. And so instead, I used travelers' accounts, everything from a medieval Buddhist monk who came from China to India, to officers of the British Raj who wrote extensively. They all seemed to have thought they were Alexander, so they wrote extensively about the places in South Asia that he went. I spent a huge amount of time with Google Earth, and I read every excavation report I could get my hands on from, every place that he went. Unfortunately, many of the places between the French excavations in Afghanistan, Soviet and French excavations in Central Asia, British excavations in South Asia, it's a really well-done area. So, but I also did a lot of sort of deep dives into things that were very outside my ken, like he fights elephants, so I did really deep dive into elephants, learned a lot about elephants. I learned about myrrh because at one point he encounters it, and I got so fascinated by myrrh. I think it was like one paragraph in the final book, but yeah. So I feel like there's like some weird form of Trivial Pursuit that I would be great at now.
Right, the Alexander edition. You mentioned that these officers of the British Raj thinking, fantasizing, cosplaying Alexander. So there's the relatively recent Briand book, Alexander the First European, where he's making this argument that the way that Alexander was received, let's say, in the 17th, 18th centuries, I mean, he kind of becomes a prototype for European imperialism. But I was wondering if on the basis of what you write and what you've been saying, to what extent you would say, or you would see those people, officers of the Rajas, as getting Alexander himself kind of wrong, or did they get him right?
Both. As often, that's the answer with Alexander, right? I would see them. Well, what I see as interesting about Alexander is that I think vis-a-vis later imperialism is that I think his story reminds us of some of the historical contingency of how imperialism works and the ways that there are certain things that I think we think of as inevitable consequences of imperialism, like, oh yes, everybody who conquers somebody else must have a civilizing mission, say the officers of the British Raj. I don't think that's how Alexander operated, and so I think, in terms of this sort of question of civilizing mission, in terms of thinking that Alexander won because his empire was technologically superior, which I think is often something that's said about later European empires, and the idea that conquerors always kind of impose a kind of apartheid, like separation of the conquerors and the conquered, and gives the conquered very little share in the government. That again is something that I think Alexander does differently, and it sort of reminds us that these later imperialists who embraced his mantle are making choices that were different.
Well, from what you've been saying, it also makes me wonder about how much the sources, right? There's this mediation of the sources. So if you look at in the 17th, 18th centuries as the sort of notion of the civilizing mission, all this kind of stuff, I mean, clearly it can be mapped onto the way that the sources seem so heavily invested in Alexander as Hellenizing. And of course, this is where we get Hellenistic and all this kind of, the world shifting and people, always getting very excited about, the discovery of Greek gymnasia in Afghanistan or whatever. That's the kind of narrative that gets pushed. Mm-hmm. And I think people might not so much realize that the Hellenizing mission of Alexander that people get so excited about, I mean, that is, essentially, this is a prototype, but maybe more from the way that the sources, in particular the Greek sources, cast it, of that then what becomes the civilizing mission. You were mentioning earlier that the sources, I guess, the politics of the sources, that it's in their interest to exaggerate certain things, to say that the Alexander was great precisely because he killed so many barbaroi, or that Alexander was great precisely because, by the time that he left Afghanistan, Sagia, Bactria, that the children were reciting verses of Sophocles and Euripides, this kind of thing. But, it makes one wonder how much, that was really the point, and how much that's the filter of the Greek sources that are very invested in a narrative of expanding the oikumene, of spreading Greek culture, and so on and so forth.
Absolutely. And I think that, for many of the Greeks, probably including those who came along with him, there's this sort of faith that Greek culture is self-evidently superior to anything the Persians had to offer. I think if you asked an elite Persian at the time, they would have looked at the Greeks and said, these guys, these are barbarians. We have 3 different kinds of flour that our emperor, our great king travels with at all times, and we have pastry chefs, and we have beautiful, rich clothing that is like nothing these guys have. I mean, and I get the sense that, we have these elaborate court protocols, whereas these guys are just, really, their manners are terrible. I get the sense that the Persians saw themselves as the inheritors of, a 2,000-year history of Near Eastern culture, and the Greeks are reduced by their standards. And I think actually this is maybe one of the things that I find interesting about Alexander. Like, I think he kind of appreciated, I don't think he was necessarily as convinced as, say, some of the Greeks that wrote later about him, that his culture was necessarily superior. And I would see things like not only his adoption of Persian dress, but he married 3 times, and each time to someone Iranian. He integrated 30,000 Persians into his army, which is an army that's as big as his. That's a big move. He named a whole, half of his governors at one point were Persian. I mean, he is really taking very seriously their culture, and I think taking it seriously, taking their civilization seriously as well. And I think that is probably one of the things, Briand also calls him the last of the Achaemenids. And I think that's the part of him that was, in a way, most effective.
Well, it seems so important that where he's starting out from is in this really complicated way, both Greek and non-Greek, right? So that there's which is obviously this sort of conflict that even persists today, but just that there is this admiration for a culture that is maybe not centered or seen as originating in the Macedonian lands, but there's, all these, of course, tales of Alexander living the Iliad and this kind of business. But then, simultaneously, there's all this pushback to saying, well, Philip can't be on the Amphictyoni. He's not Greek. All these, stories about the Olympics, right? The Athenians calling the Macedonians barbaroi. It just seems to be sort of so contingent, so dependent on the particular political situation. So he's already starting out from this kind of both and position. I mean, I wonder if that helped things along.
Yeah, I think he's an outsider. He's an outsider, in essence, to Greek culture. Remember, his mother is not even from Macedonia. She's from Epirus, the country next door. So he is already being sneered at by Macedonians for not being Macedonian. And I think that outsider's perspective is part of what allows him, despite this incredible amount of political power he has, to be able to kind of adopt the worldview of others and get a little bit more open and see things from their perspective. He's not perfect at it, for sure, but I think that he's better than most people at his time.
Thank you so much. I just want to ask you, what's next for you?
Right. So when I did this book, one of the things that stood out to me was how it seemed like at some point everything that Alexander did happened at a feast. We think of him as this great battler, but in fact, he nearly gets killed by his father at a feast. He marries his first wife at a feast. He kills somebody at a feast. It was like all these banquets. And so I got really interested in feasting in the ancient world. And so I'm thinking about a book that brings together archaeological material with literary material, with, conservation science, to really talk about the sort of history of the ancient Mediterranean diet through 4 famous feasts.
Oh, wow. What a great topic.
Yeah, it's really, really fun.
Well, I'll look forward to that. Yeah. I think it just leaves us to wrap up with a little word association game. If you're
okay.
Game
all
yourself
right.
for it.
Sure.
Okay. So I'm just going to list off a couple terms and you just tell me the first thing that comes to mind without overthinking or even really thinking. Okay. They'll be easy. All right, so the first is Bessus.
Crucifixion.
The wedding at Susa.
Gold.
The Hetairoi, the companions.
Fight.
Okay. And since we mentioned her, Barsine.
Gonna say love.
Love, okay. And we'll wrap it up with Alexander the Great.
Kousser.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel, and congratulations on the book, and thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you. It's been great.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesche podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to Brown University's Department of Classical Studies and the John Carter Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesche.